The originality of Darwin was quite profound with his ideas about natural selection. Many people would know that he wasn't original in evolution because other people came up with ideas about evolution, including his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. But where his originality came was with a mechanism, natural selection. And it's, I think, important to push the term survival of the fittest to the back of one's mind because Darwin's mechanism is really about what happens when some individuals reproduce better than others. It's about reproductive success, okay? It's no wonder then that sexual selection is probably the most important of the processes proposed by Darwin, especially in terms of the speed of evolution. As a consequence of these extremely rare successful lineages, the ends of which we see today, the final products we see today in living organisms, we see successful adaptations that have been passed down. We see the characters that made them successful. We see birds with wings that make them fly well. We see flowers with plants with flowers and make them attract pollinators well. And we see peacocks with peacocks' tails that are bizarre, but make them extremely successful in attracting mates. And really, sexual selection is evolution, adaptation, in the context of competition to get mates. What we do is, as sexual selectionists, like if I can use that term, is we study mating success. However, population geneticists, people that study genes over time, changing in gene pools, they tell me, no, we can actually get a better handle. It turns out that modern molecular methods have really given us some really insights into this reproductive potential. You're exactly right. It's gamete size is the only thing that really separates male from female across all. And we have pollen grain versus ovule in plants. It's because some species, the vice versa of my title, don't fall into this categorization, this generality. But it's certainly true that across animals at least, the male is the flashy, attractive sex, okay? So the male, this is the other part of Darwin's idea, which is also competition within males, between males, I should say. The aggression part. It's true, and also, along with aggression, weaponry. Males exhibit, in a lot of species, exhibit weaponry that they use in battle to get access to females. So why do we see this diversity? Males mostly have the weapons, and they're the ones that are competitive, et cetera, et cetera. Darwin's thought was, it was simply males were subject to greater sexual selection. Okay? He left it at that. And it's been more recent researchers in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s mainly, that came up with a body of theory to explain why males are masculine and females are feminine, and the vice versa. First of all, they said, the argument's a straightforward one, which is, if there's selection going on, there's usually competition for a resource. The resource is females. Here we have a bunch of male wasps all gathered around one receptive female. Even if the species is a 1-to-1 ratio, there are very few receptive females around. Females ready to mate around relative to males. Reason why? The females are doing other things. And this is the idea that parental investment and this reproductive potential I talked about earlier feeds in then to change the ratio of receptive males and females. Parental investment, we've already talked about gametes. By definition, females invest more in the egg. And as in the case of this bizarre chicken, she also provides parental care to those eggs, okay? And that is thought to be the general theory underlying, that's the general theory underlying sex differences. Certain species of seahorses, or relatives of seahorses, the males get pregnant, and the females have flashy ornaments. There are some birds where males provide exclusive care for the eggs, and the females have flashy ornaments. This is a female of a katydid related to crickets, bending around, the male's left, she's mated, and she's eating this great big gift. It's like a bowl of warm cheese from mozzarella cheese from pizza. It's very nutritious. She eats this, and it turns out it's extremely nutritious when she's hungry. When populations are very competitive for food, there's very little food around, proteinaceous food, that is important. It turns the females into promiscuous mating machines. They're not mating for sperm anymore, they're mating for mozzarella cheese bowls, okay? And it turns the males, because the males now, they're restricted, they're not ingesting much in the way of food because they're starved too, they can't crank out many of these cheese bowls, so they become very choosy. Females are competitive, and males are choosy. What's intriguing is in other populations where they're well-fed, where they look well-fed, we get the typical roles, which is first of all to do the obvious, to set up field enclosures and change food supply. Keep everything else constant. Do a good ecological experiment, sex ratio, everything else was kept constant. And what we find is, when we look at the typical roles of well-fed cages, and these are means of all the cages, we find in the well-fed cages lots of female choice and even quite a bit of male combat, the typical roles. In the deprived cages, we find almost none of those two, okay? It's when we switch to the reversed roles, there we find in the well-fed cages almost no male choice, or the sex roles are reversed now. We've got male choice and female combat. Almost none of that in the well-fed cages, but all kinds in the food-deprived cages. A manipulation of the hypothesis. And what's really neat is that physiological lab experiments have shown that the mozzarella cheese ball proteins of the male make up most of the egg. So the male is actually providing more parental investment in the female. He's helping her manufacture the egg. But importantly, we've also shown incredible flexibility, plasticity of the mating roles within a so-called simple organism, the insect. These animals, these insects, are cueing into environmental cues, numbers of mates available, etc., food availability, in a very subtle way to determine whether they're choosy or competitive. Doesn't matter what the sex. And I use that to drive home a really important lesson about all aspects of biology, which is they're flexible. It's not determined genetically. It's not genetic determinism. It's a combination. It's always a gene-environment interaction. And these katydid insects have been great examples of that. Anyway, finally, I can't go on without talking about man flu. And what's interesting is the sex differences in immune response I told you about earlier, we find in these same insects. So here we have lots of food again. Same set of experiments, in an experiment just done very recently, typical roles. We find the females have the most robust encapsulation is a measure of immune system. The most robust immune system than the males. But what happens when you reverse the roles with starving them? What happens is the females start to do this trade-off thing. They're now into mating effort and tracking down males and becoming promiscuous to get their cheese balls. As a consequence, their immune system becomes male-like, masculine. Okay? So I think I've said enough. Thank you.